Hi everyone. Okay, so this is a resource to help those of you who weren't able to make the session that I did the other day. In terms of what I'm going to cover, I just want to go through the experimental design and what was actually done to make sense of that Word document that I've already uploaded, and to go through the kind of structure of how to put the lab report together, and then probably in a separate document go through the data analysis for this. So if you've got any questions, then drop me an email and I'll get back to you. But for those of you who are intending on using the lab-based data for your study, hopefully you're all aware that if you log on to Learning Space, find your independent study military module, and then you're going to scroll down to right at the bottom, there's a section on the pre-workout nutrition experiment. So what I want to do now is focus on the methods, and just so you've got some idea as to what we actually did. That will then help you. For those of you who haven't already done the proposal, you can get on with that and then upload that as soon as possible. In terms of that proposal, you need to make sure that when you fill out the documentation, that's up here for your proposal part 1 stuff, you need to make sure that you make reference to the fact that the study has already been completed and that we've got data and that it's already had full ethical approval. Okay, so make sure that that's outlined on there, and then you can fill out the rest of the paperwork. And at some point, if I've got time, I'll do another document to go through that. Okay, so if we take a look at the experiment, and what I'll do is if I go through what we actually did, then it'll make sense when I put that into the main kind of lab report information. So over here we've got the method. So the context behind it is that we know there's a lot of supplements available on the market, and that in general people are taking those without necessarily the scientific evidence. So the background was that we were approached by a nutritional kind of magazine to have a look at a particular well-known supplement to actually see, is there scientific evidence and kind of physiological underpinning that this pre-workout works in terms of actually being able to increase kind of repetition to failure work for deadlift and bench. So that's the main kind of premise behind what was done. So in terms of the method section itself, the subheadings that you're going to need to work with are, the first one are the subject characteristics. So what we're looking at here, and you'll see this in any journal article, is you need to provide some information about the subject characteristics. So we need to know what their mean and their standard deviation was. Oops, sorry, underline there. For their characteristics in terms of how many were there. So in this case, you can see we've got 9 people, and we need to know what their mean age was, their height, and all those typical characteristics. Now you'll be able to access that over here, in this Excel document here, which I'll open up later. You'll see it's got a whole information on the subject characteristics and what needs to be done. So you can pull that into there, and at this point as well, you need to say that they gave informed consent and they completed a PAR-Q. So that's your basic subject characteristic information. The next section that you're going to need to specify in the report is what we call the protocol. Okay, so the protocol is really, it's different from a procedures in that this is, if you like, the kind of overall the overall design of the experiment. So what did they actually do? How many testing sessions were there? What was the basic overview of the supplementation protocol? So you can see here that there's some information about how many lab visits there were. So if I explain those to you, so you can see the guys came into the lab 4 different occasions. The first one was a familiarization trial, but in particular the most important thing here was that these guys came in for that first session to assess their 1RMs for bench and deadlift, and also just to be aware of all the kind of lab procedures that we were using, such as taking blood, using the gym aware and various things. So that first session was 1RM testing. The second one, which is the main experimental trials, was 3 visits, and during that they were in 3 different conditions: a placebo, which was where they took basically maltodextrin, so a carbohydrate with no known kind of effects in terms of improving performance in this particular experiment. A caffeine only trial where they took an anhydrous caffeine substance, and then the last one was the actual pre-workout, which in this case was grenade, and all of those were masked. So can you see here it says it was a double-blind randomised trial. What that means is that none of the subjects knew what they were taking. It was randomised in that they all did it in different order. So for example, one subject came in and did the placebo, then the caffeine, then the pre-workout in that order of testing, whereas another guy did the caffeine first and pre-workout and then placebo. And what that does is it eliminates any training effect. So that was the purpose behind the double-blind randomised. By being double-blind, it meant that when I was obviously giving out supplements, I didn't know what they were, so I can influence how they responded to the testing. And you can see that the testing was done obviously in our S&C facility on 3 separate occasions, and each of those had a minimum of 48 hours in between to make sure that obviously there was sufficient recovery from it. Okay, so that's the kind of overall experimental design that you would structure as a protocol section. The next one that you'll then put in is what we kind of refer to as the procedure section. So this one here is more the kind of step-by-step, what actually happened, what kind of things did we take. So initially, this experimental is experimental trial 1. So during that, I said the familiarization trial, or that first one, was about establishing the 1RMs for bench and deadlift and also taking their body composition. The main trials from that, you can see this is a kind of bullet pointed account, so you need to expand this and write it into full sentences. But you can see on the main day, before they came to the lab, 24 hours before they needed to refrain from caffeine ingestion. That was obviously important because we were comparing our pre-workout to a caffeine-only trial. We wanted to make sure that they were sufficiently hydrated, so they were asked to drink a minimum of 1.5 litres the evening before and then 500 ml on the morning of testing. We also then took a hydration status measure through a urine osmolality check. And in terms of the information about where you can find all the equipment we used, I'll direct you to a website where we've got all that information for you. That was all before they got to the lab. When they actually got to the lab on the day of testing, as we said before, they had full information regarding the experiment, therefore they gave written consent and the PARQ. And then we took some standard anthropometric measures such as height, weight, and also percentage body fat. That urine sample was taken, and then here we've also got some other baseline measures. So we took a resting blood pressure. You can see that was then repeated at the end of the workouts and 24 hours post. And also here what we've got is a baseline blood lactate measure, and also this is our creatine kinase measure that we took. And hopefully you'll all be aware that creatine kinase is one of our key markers of muscle damage. So if we're seeing a more significant amount of muscle damage from a workout, then we'll be able to look at that through elevations in creatine kinase. So we took that at the beginning to make sure that we had an initial baseline value for muscle damage. Vertical jump, so counter movement jump was also taken, because we know with our monitoring of performance that obviously counter movement jump can give you an idea as to potential fatigue or residual fatigue. So it's important that we establish that vertical jump at the beginning and looked at how that altered in accordance with what they were taking. These were the supplements that were taken, the quantities and how they were taken. So the subjects, once they'd done these baseline measures, then ingested the supplement, whether it was pre-workout caffeine or placebo, in a standardised 200 ml fluid volume that was flavoured to try and disguise what they were taking. So we used a lemon flavour for that. They then took that, and in accordance with the kind of manufacturer guidelines, they then undertook a standardised warm-up, which was a standard ramp warm-up. So our raising work with rowing, and then obviously appropriate activation mobilisation work. The vertical jump was done, and then this is the main session here. So the key part is that these guys were doing a repetition to failure work. They worked at a fixed 75% of their 1RM established previously from the initial familiarization trial. They completed up to 15 reps or to failure. So they either might have done, say, 8 reps to failure, or if they'd actually got to 15, which they shouldn't have done because it's quite heavy, then they were stopped at that point. They did bench press first, and then they had an amount of work before they then went on to look at the deadlift. During this time, the subjective markers were taken. We know that through pre-workouts they proposed to increase alertness fatigue, reduce fatigue and so forth. So we took an end of workout session RPE to give us an idea as to how hard the athletes actually found the session, and we also got them to record their soreness analog scale, which again over here I've got those two kind of analog scales you can have a look at. And just, there was a lot of data that was taken during this experiment, and just to clarify at this point, there is no need to actually look at absolutely everything. GymAware, I think you guys have seen the GymAware system. You know that that's going to measure our velocities throughout the sets. So when they were doing their different sets and reps, we took a velocity for each repetition to have a look at how that altered. And then finally, the blood measures, which kind of alluded to earlier, took a baseline blood lactate, and then at the end of the bench press and deadlift, there was a 3 minutes sample taken. And then similar with the creatine kinase, because we're looking at muscle damage in particular and how that elevates 24 hours later and 48 hours, we took those measures at those time points. And again, a counter movement jump, just to look at any potential neuromuscular fatigue, was taken 24 hours. So the idea of these measures was have a look at baseline when they're well rested, undertake their repetition to failures for bench press and deadlift, and then have a look at kind of time phase data. So the next day and then the day after that, what's actually happening in terms of their soreness, their ability to recover, and therefore looking at these kind of blood markers here. So that's really the kind of overall talk through of the experiment. So, it's very much establish potential look at their 1RMs and body comp, come to the lab, take a series of baseline measures, go through this repetition to failure work. And they did, I should say, and I will confirm this in the methods in a bit, but they did I believe they did 3 sets within each of these. So they did 3 sets of bench, and they were separated by 2 minutes, and then they had a 5-minute break between the bench and the deadlift, and then they repeated it for 3 sets. But in a second, I'll go through an example of a report in terms of what the structure should look like, but hopefully that's given you enough to put your methods together for your main lab report. So subject characteristics is the first one. So let's put that as 1. The second one is the protocol, and then the third one is the procedures. Now you can use subheadings within those if you want to, and the main thing with that procedures is obviously to document the prior to arrival, and then on the day what was the actual step-by-step testing. You've got a bullet pointed approach to it here, but you just need to write that into full sentences. And then the last one, which is kind of missing, that's not going to work, is our 4th section, which is our data analysis. Now you'll be relieved to know that I'm not going to expect you to do any statistical analysis for this, but what you are going to do is look at the data from the perspective of means and standard deviations. And there we go, sorry I can't do more than one thing at a time. And actually have a look at some key things in terms of variables. So you're going to need to establish what you want to look at. So for example, you could look at means and standard deviations for a number of measures such as total reps performed or total velocities, whatever you think is appropriate, blood measures and stuff. Now normally we take you a step further and ask you to do statistical analysis to prove if there is significance, but for this the main purpose is purely just to have a look in terms of graphical representation, what's happening to the data, and can we actually start to see whether this pre-workout is effective or not. So hopefully that's given you an idea of the experiment, and what I will do in a second is go through an example of a report. So there's another document coming your way, but as I said, any questions, give me a shout. Okay, hope that helps. Cheers.